There is a moment, and you've had it, where you felt completely out of control. Maybe it was something you said in anger that you can never take back. Maybe it was a spiral of emotion so dark and so consuming that you couldn't find your way out of it for days. Maybe it was looking at your bank account and feeling genuine shame, not because you're lazy or stupid, but because you never learned to control the invisible force that pulls money out of your hands before you even realize it's gone. Or maybe it was lying awake at 3 in the morning, your own mind turning against you, replaying every mistake, every fear, every worst-case scenario until you were exhausted but couldn't sleep. Most people will live their entire lives in that state. They'll call it just how I am. They'll call it personality. They'll call it bad luck or bad circumstances or the economy or the way they were raised. The Stoics called it something different. They called it slavery. And they had a cure. Over 2,000 years ago, in the harshest conditions imaginable, Roman slave pits, gladiatorial cities, corrupt political systems, plagues, wars, exile, a small group of thinkers discovered something extraordinary. They realized that there were exactly 4 forces inside every human being that, when left unmanaged, would destroy any life no matter how talented, no matter how privileged, no matter how gifted that person was. 4 forces that, when mastered, would make any person essentially unconquerable. Your mouth, your mood, your money, your mind. I want to be clear with you from the very beginning. This isn't a video about positive thinking. This isn't about repeating affirmations in the mirror. This is about something far older, far harder, and far more effective than anything the modern self-help industry will ever sell you. This is about discipline. The kind that doesn't feel good in the beginning. The kind that the ancient Stoics practiced not because it was comfortable, but because they understood a truth that most people today have completely forgotten. A person who cannot govern themselves cannot govern anything. And a person who can govern themselves cannot be defeated by anything. If you're willing to sit with that, really sit with it, then stay with me. Because what follows might be the most practically important thing you ever watch. Before we go into the 4 disciplines themselves, I want to tell you about a man. Not because his story is inspirational in the warm, fuzzy sense, but because his story is a demolition of every excuse you and I have ever made about why we can't change. His name was Epictetus. Was born into slavery. He had no choice in this, no say, no rights. His body belonged to another man, his time, his labor, his movement, all of it controlled by someone else. And as if that weren't enough, his master, a man named Epaphroditus, once decided to torture him by twisting his leg. The story goes that Epictetus calmly told his master, "You are going to break it." The master continued. The leg broke. Epictetus reportedly said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" No screaming, no begging, no collapse into despair. Just a man who had discovered that while another human being could own his body, nobody could own what happened inside him. That is not a motivational story. That is a philosophical position. That is a radical, tested, ancient understanding of where power actually lives in a human being. Most of us today are not physically enslaved, but walk through any city, scroll through any social media feed, sit in any traffic jam, and look at the people around you. Watch how many of them are enslaved to their own mouths, saying things they don't mean, making promises they don't keep, speaking out of fear or insecurity or anger. Watch how many people are enslaved to their moods, waking up already defeated, riding emotional waves they didn't choose and can't explain, letting a single bad interaction ruin an entire week. Watch how many people are enslaved to their spending, trapped in cycles of earning and consuming, never getting ahead, never feeling secure, always one financial shock away from crisis. And watch how many people are enslaved to their own thoughts, lying awake at night being tortured by a mind they've never learned to direct. Epictetus, a man who had every external reason to be hopeless, discovered something that should humiliate all of us. The only real prison is an undisciplined self. And the door to that prison has always been unlocked from the inside. Pillar 1. Master your mouth, the power of deliberate speech. The ancient Stoics believed that speech was not a casual thing. It was, in their view, one of the most powerful forces available to a human being, and one of the most dangerously misused. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, is famously reported to have said, Asterisk, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. But it goes much deeper than that simple ratio. Consider what your words actually do. Every time you open your mouth, you are not just transmitting information. You are doing something to yourself. You are either reinforcing a version of yourself that serves you, or you are reinforcing a version of yourself that destroys you. When you speak impulsively, when you snap at someone, when you gossip, when you complain reflexively, when you promise something you know you won't follow through on, you are not just creating a bad moment. You are training yourself. You are teaching your own nervous system that you are the kind of person who does those things, and over time, that training calcifies into identity. The person who constantly complains doesn't just have a complaining habit, they become a complainer. The person who lies casually doesn't just tell white lies, they become someone who cannot be trusted, not even by themselves. The person who lashes out when stressed doesn't just have bad days. They become, in the perception of everyone around them, volatile and unsafe. This is why the Stoic philosophers treated speech as a form of self-creation. Seneca, writing his famous letters to his young friend Lucilius, put it with characteristic bluntness: retire into yourself as much as you can. And one of the primary ways he meant this was through restraint in speech. To think before you speak is not politeness, it is a philosophical act. It is the act of a person who understands that their words are literal building materials for who they are. But here is what most people get wrong about mastering your mouth. They think it's entirely about holding back. They think discipline in speech means silence, coldness, becoming some kind of sphinx who never reveals themselves. That is not Stoic wisdom. That is emotional repression, and it doesn't work. The Stoic approach to speech is about intentionality in both directions. Yes, restraint when restraint is called for, the pause before the response, the breath before the accusation, the deliberate choice not to say something hurtful just because you feel hurt. But also, and this is equally important, the intentional use of words that build. Every time you speak an honest encouragement to someone who is struggling, you are not just helping them, you are training your own attention to look for what is right rather than what is wrong. Every time you articulate your own values clearly, rather than being swept along by whatever the crowd is saying, you are strengthening your sense of self. Every time you say what you mean rather than what you think people want to hear, you are building the rarest quality in modern life: genuine trustworthiness. Marcus Aurelius, who was arguably the most powerful man on earth during his reign as Roman emperor, wrote to himself in his private journal, a journal he never intended for anyone else to read, about his own struggles with speech. He wrote about his frustration with people who talked more than they thought. He wrote about his commitment to mean what he said and say what he meant, even when it was politically inconvenient. Here was a man who could have said anything and nobody would have stopped him, choosing deliberately to hold himself to a higher standard. That is the key insight. Mastering your mouth is not something you do for other people. You do it for the construction of your own character. Here is a practice that the Stoics used, and that you can begin immediately. Before you speak in any emotionally charged moment, ask yourself 3 questions in quick succession. Not slowly, not laboriously, this becomes rapid with practice. First, is what I'm about to say actually true, or am I working from assumption and emotion? Second, does saying this serve anything good? Third, can I say this in a way that is clear and honest without being unnecessarily cruel? If the answer to any of these is clearly no, say less. Say nothing if necessary. The Stoics were deeply comfortable with silence. They understood that silence is not weakness. It is the refusal to let your mouth outrun your wisdom. Do this consistently for 30 days and you will notice something remarkable. People will begin to listen to you differently. Not because you've manipulated them, but because you've become someone whose words carry actual weight. And more importantly, you will listen to yourself differently. You will start to recognize that you are, word by word, choosing who you are. Pillar 2. Master your mood, becoming the author of your emotional life. There's a story from the Stoic tradition about a philosopher named Stilpo. When the conqueror Demetrius sacked his city and destroyed everything he owned, burning it to the ground, Demetrius turned to him and asked with mocking contempt, "Have you lost anything?" Stilpo replied without hesitation, "No, I have everything that is mine." He meant his character, his reasoning, his inner state. This is the Stoic understanding of mood. Your emotional life is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in. And the degree to which you understand that participation is the degree to which you have real power. Now, before someone says that this sounds callous or that it invalidates real pain, stop. The Stoics were not telling us to become emotional robots. Epictetus grieved. Marcus Aurelius grieved. Seneca knew dark nights. They were human beings who felt deeply. The point was never to eliminate emotion. The point was to stop being dragged unconsciously by emotion into actions and states that you didn't actually choose. Think about the last time your mood was hijacked. Maybe someone at work said something dismissive. Maybe traffic made you late. Maybe you woke up and just felt wrong, that inexplicable heaviness that some mornings carry. And from that initial trigger, your entire day became shaped by the feeling it produced. You were short with your family. You were disengaged at work. You ate badly, slept poorly, and then spent part of the night lying awake feeling guilty about how you'd behaved. That is not a flaw in your character. That is a system that was never properly maintained. That is a mood left on autopilot, left to be controlled by whatever external input happened to arrive first. The Stoics developed a concept called provocation, which translates roughly as attention to oneself. It was a daily, ongoing practice of watching your own inner state with the same kind of careful observation that a skilled craftsman watches his work. Not with judgment, not with self-criticism, just with clear, honest attention. Because you cannot manage what you cannot see. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus made a distinction that is absolutely foundational to this practice. The distinction between the initial impression and the response. When something happens, when you receive bad news, when someone offends you, when circumstances go wrong, there is a split second before your reaction. The ancient Stoics called this the fantasia, the impression. Your reaction to the impression is where your freedom lives. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to develop one of the most influential schools of modern psychology, came to the exact same conclusion through his own unimaginably difficult experience. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is your power to choose. In your choice lies your growth and your freedom. He didn't know Epictetus. He didn't know Marcus Aurelius. He arrived at the same truth through suffering. That truth is not coincidental. It is structural. It is built into the nature of human consciousness. So how do you actually practice this? The Stoics recommended beginning with the morning. Before your day starts, before you check your phone, before you respond to anything, before you let the external world begin flooding in, take a moment to set your inner state deliberately. Marcus Aurelius did this. His meditations are full of morning reflections, many of them preemptive. He would anticipate difficult people, frustrating circumstances, setbacks, and remind himself before they arrived what his response would be. This is not wishful thinking. This is psychological rehearsal. Athletes do it. Surgeons do it. Military commanders do it. And the ancient Stoics were doing it 2,000 years before modern performance psychology gave it a name. The second practice is what the Stoics called the view from above. When you're caught in an emotionally turbulent moment, when your mood has been hijacked and you can feel yourself reacting rather than responding, imagine stepping back. Imagine seeing the situation from a distance, not to minimize it, not to dismiss your own experience, but to see it in proportion. Most of the things that spike our emotional cortisol into the red zone are, in the scale of an actual life, small. The traffic jam, the rude colleague, the disappointment. Seeing them from above doesn't make them disappear, but it prevents them from becoming the whole world. Here is what changes when you genuinely begin to master your mood. You stop being someone other people have to manage. You stop leaking your internal weather onto the people around you. You become, instead, a stabilizing presence, the kind of person others feel calm around because your calm is real and not performed. And paradoxically, when you stop fighting your emotions and start directing them, you actually feel more, not less, because you're not spending all your energy on suppression. You're free to actually inhabit your emotional life, rather than being ruled by it. Pillar 3. Master your money, the Stoic philosophy of wealth. Here is something the modern financial industry will never say to you, because it would destroy their business model. The primary reason most people struggle financially has nothing to do with income. It has everything to do with character. That sounds harsh, but hear me out, because this is not a judgment, it is a liberation. The Stoics were not ascetics. They were not telling people to live in poverty. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. Crassus, who had Stoic teachers, was famously the richest man of his era. Marcus Aurelius presided over the treasury of an empire. These were not people who were afraid of wealth or who believed that money was inherently corrupting. What they understood, what they were ferocious about, was the relationship between a person and their money. Specifically, whether you own your wealth or whether your wealth owns you. Seneca wrote something in his letters that is as relevant today as it was then, possibly more so given the consumer culture we now swim in. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor. Think about that carefully. In a world engineered at extraordinary technological sophistication, to manufacture craving, this is a revolutionary statement. We live inside a system that earns money every time you feel dissatisfied. Every advertisement is, at its core, the creation of a gap between who you are and who you would be if you bought this thing. Every social media scroll is calibrated to produce comparison, and comparison is the engine of artificial desire. The Stoics called these manufactured desires false goods. They were not against pleasure, but they distinguished sharply between pleasures that genuinely enriched life and pleasures that were simply the temporary anesthetic for a deeper emptiness. Pleasures that, once consumed, left you needing more rather than feeling satisfied. The Stoic discipline of money begins not with a budget. It begins with a philosophical question. What do I actually value? Not what do I think I should value. Not what my social circle signals I should value. Not what is advertised to me as the marker of success. What do I, upon reflection, actually value? For most people, the honest answer is remarkably similar. Meaningful relationships, freedom from constant anxiety, the ability to be present in their life rather than perpetually stressed about it, work that feels purposeful, health, security. Notice what's absent from that list. Almost none of the things most people actually spend their money on. This is the gap that the Stoics were pointing to. The gap between your stated values and your spending habits is a direct measure of how much your money controls you rather than the other way around. One of the practices the Stoics used, and this one is worth sitting with, was voluntary discomfort. Seneca deliberately lived for short periods as if he had very little, not because he had to, but because he wanted to test his relationship to comfort and luxury. He wanted to know, if this were taken away, would I still be whole? You don't have to take it that far, but consider this. The next time you feel a strong impulse to spend money on something you didn't wake up that morning intending to buy, wait 24 hours. That's it, just 24 hours. And in that gap, ask yourself, does this align with what I actually say I value? Or is this the gap, the manufactured dissatisfaction speaking? Mastery over money is not about deprivation. It is about ensuring that every financial decision you make is a genuine expression of your values rather than a reaction to someone else's engineering of your desires. When you achieve that, something remarkable happens. Money becomes a tool rather than a source of constant anxiety. And the freedom that produces is not a financial freedom. It is an existential one. Pillar 4. Master your mind, the final frontier. We have saved the most important for last, because everything we have discussed, your words, your emotions, your financial choices, all of it flows from one source. What happens inside your mind? The mind is where the Stoics were most sophisticated and where modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm what they intuited thousands of years ago. The mind is not a passive receiver. It is an active creator. And what you allow to live in your mind determines, with frightening precision, what you experience as your life. Marcus Aurelius wrote, again in private, in a journal he never intended anyone to read, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." This was not a slogan. This was a man who had spent decades watching his own mind, testing its edges, fighting its tendencies, and coming to a conclusion that he staked his reign, his character, and his legacy on. The quality of your thoughts. Not the quality of your circumstances. Not the quality of your relationships, your health, your finances. All of those things matter, of course, but they are secondary to the quality of the internal narrative that runs constantly in the background of your consciousness. Here is an experiment you can run right now. Think about the primary story you tell yourself about your life, not the story you tell other people, the one that runs quietly underneath everything, the one that colors how you interpret what happens to you. For many people, that story contains at least some version of the following: I'm not good enough. Things never work out for me. I don't have what it takes. Other people are luckier, smarter, more connected. I've missed my chance. I'm too old, too young, too broken, too far behind. Where does that story come from? Largely from unexamined repetition, from thoughts that were never chosen, that arrived from painful experiences, from other people's projections, from cultural messages absorbed without filter, and were then rehearsed so many times that they calcified into what feels like just the truth. The Stoics called this process assent. The moment when you take a thought and agree with it, make it part of your worldview. And they were deeply interested in the question of which thoughts we should assent to and which we should reject. This is where the Stoic concept of the ruling faculty becomes essential. In Greek, they called it the hegemonikon, the governing, directing part of the mind, the part that has the capacity to observe thought rather than being entirely immersed in it. This is what modern neuroscience calls metacognition, thinking about thinking. The cultivation of the hegemonikon is essentially the practice of creating space between you and your thoughts. Just as we discussed creating space between stimulus and response in the mood section, here we are creating space between a thought's arrival and your decision about whether to believe it, nurture it, or let it go. This is not easy. It is, in fact, the hardest practice of all four, because thoughts feel like reality. When a thought arrives telling you that you are failing, that feeling of being a failure is immediate and physical. When a thought arrives predicting catastrophe, the anxiety it produces is real, bodily, and urgent. The Stoics did not deny this. They were not suggesting that you just decide not to think negative thoughts and it all becomes easy. They were proposing something far more rigorous, a daily, lifelong practice of observation, questioning, and redirection. The practice works like this. First, you must develop the ability to catch a thought, to notice it rather than simply be it. This is harder than it sounds, and is why the Stoics recommended practices that quieted the external noise. Silence, journaling, periods of solitary reflection. When the world is constantly feeding stimulus into your mind, observation becomes nearly impossible. You must create conditions for it. Second, once you catch a thought, you question it. Not attack it, not suppress it, question it. The question is simple: is this actually true? And more importantly, is this useful? Note that useful is different from comfortable. A thought can be deeply uncomfortable and still be useful, a clear-eyed recognition of a real problem that needs addressing. What is never useful is catastrophizing, rumination, self-attack, and the endless rehearsal of worst-case scenarios. Third, you redirect. When a thought is neither true nor useful, you deliberately replace it with a question or a direction, not a positive affirmation, an active question, not "I am capable and powerful," because a mind in distress will immediately reject that as false. Instead, what is the most useful thing I can do in the next hour? Or, what is actually within my control here? Active questions engage the problem-solving capacity of the mind and pull it away from the anxious spiral. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about living according to nature. Not nature in the environmental sense, but human nature, which they defined as fundamentally rational. To live according to your nature as a rational being is to let your mind function as it is capable of functioning. Clearly, effectively, in alignment with your actual values. The mind mastered is not a mind that never produces fear, doubt, or darkness. It is a mind that has learned to observe those states without being controlled by them. A mind that knows itself well enough to know when it is producing useful signal and when it is producing noise. A mind that can, with practice, be directed rather than driven. This is the final pillar, and when it stands alongside the other three, what you have built is not just better habits. What you have built is a self. Here is what nobody in the self-help space tells you, because it doesn't sell courses. Real transformation is slow. It is incremental. It is not a breakthrough moment. It is not the video you watched that changed everything in one sitting. It is 1,000 small decisions made in ordinary moments when nobody is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. It is the pause before you speak, the 100th time you pause, not the first. It is the morning you wake up in a difficult mood and choose not to let it define the day, the 50th time you make that choice, not the first. The person who masters these 4 disciplines does not become extraordinary in the flashy, visible sense. They don't necessarily become famous or wealthy or publicly powerful, but they become something rarer and more valuable than any of those things. They become reliable to others and to themselves. That reliability, that quality of being someone who can be counted on to respond rather than react, to spend with intention rather than impulse, to speak with honesty rather than convenience, to think with clarity rather than fear. That is the foundation of everything worth building in a human life. If this reached something in you, share it with one person who needs it. Drop a comment telling me which of the 4 pillars you're working on first. And subscribe, because this is just the beginning of the journey we're taking together.